Hello, and welcome to the 19th episode of Let's Learn Blades in the Dark. In this episode, we will discuss indulging vices. Indulging vices is the final downtime activity which we'll discuss in this series, and it's worth digging a little bit into how it is described. So the text says that the scoundrels of Doskvol are a special lot. They defy the powers that be and dare to prey on those who are considered to be their betters. They push themselves further than ordinary people are willing to go. But this comes at a cost. Their life is one of constant stress. Inevitably, each turns to the seduction of a vice in order to cope. A character's vice is their obsession. But with this indulgence comes relief from stress and the ability to once again face the overwhelming challenge of their daring life. So there are a number of things that we can take away from this description. Vice is narratively about coping. It's about coping with stress, coping with the life of a scoundrel. And this means that as a GM, you should be putting the PCs in situations where they are overwhelmed, where there is too much to handle without being overstressed, where they are pushed to indulge their vices. Now, this isn't a principle that's actually listed in the GM section, but it is worth considering. Another thing to discuss is this description here. Vice impacts character motivations, goals, and behavior. When you ponder what your character might do or say next, you can always consider their vice to help you think of something. So this means that vice, along with trauma, which is the other mechanic associated with stress, fuels characterization and role-playing. It is something that helps to develop a character through play rather than being something that is clearly defined at the start of play. It's something that develops, that plays out as the character goes to seek their vices as they overindulge. Then it creates hooks for more narrative. It gets them into relationships. It gets them into trouble. And the last thing I wanted to mention about the description of vice in this section of the book is that it says that the scoundrels take on targets that are above their station. Now, this isn't necessarily something that you will have to do in the game, but the rules certainly encourage it because of the way that reputation is handed out. So there's a lot of mechanics that will push characters to take on higher tier targets. And when they take on higher tier targets, they will have to spend stress to be effective against them. And then that will push them towards indulging their vice. So even though these points are not actually included in the GM principles for the game, which is where you would expect to see them in most PBTA games, they nevertheless will emerge through play just because of the way the mechanics are set up. So let's talk about the vice roll itself. First, the player rolls dice equal to their lowest attribute ratings. You can't choose which attribute rating to use. You just take the lowest one. And again, this creates an incentive to create a more well-rounded character because you're going to get more dice on your vice rolls. Then you clear stress equal to your highest die result. So you roll your lowest attribute rating and you clear stress equal to your highest die result. Now, if you clear more stress levels than you had marked, you overindulge, and then there's going to be consequences. So again, if you have too high attributes, then the chances of you overindulging are higher And that's naturally something that's going to happen the more advancements your character has. So the more you play, the more likely it is you will overindulge, even though you can also take more stress on for each score. If you do not or cannot indulge your vice during downtime, you take stress equal to your number of trauma. So this is actually very important to the overall structure of play. You know, the reasons I mentioned before also push stress, but what this means is that once you get further into the game and you start to have trauma, then you are pretty much going to want to be indulging your vice every downtime. And that means you have less downtime activities to spend on clearing your heat. And it also means you are more likely to overindulge because you're making more vice rolls and because your attributes are higher. So the pressure in this game cranks up the more you play. So at the start, you don't have any of these factors pushing you, and also you have a lot of stress to burn and zero trauma. Once you start taking trauma, once you start taking advancements, then things become more and more stressful. And this I already mentioned. And yeah, it's important to note that all of these pressures offset the bonuses you get from having advancements, from having increased tier, and also from having coin available to you. So to continue discussing the vice roll, the vice roll is like a resistance roll in reverse. You clear stress with it instead of adding stress. So you can add stress when you resist a consequence and clear stress when you do a vice roll. It requires a downtime activity or a session for a character to be lost in their vice. In addition to that, it requires a purveyor of vice. And there's some good examples on page 299, assuming you are playing in the DOSFall setting. If you were playing in Uduasha, then you will need to come up with a different list of vice purveyors. So let's talk about being lost in vice. This mechanic allows a player to clear stress without using a downtime activity. So this can be useful, especially during a score. You say, boom, I'm lost in my vice. They retire the character for a session and use a new or different PC, which helps to fill out a cast of characters to improve world building and to sort of flesh out the crew. And this also allows players to give some depth to NPCs who have been in the background. So let's say you hire an expert with the acquire asset downtime activity, and then later on in play, one of your characters is lost in vice or is just straight up lost because of overindulging. Then you can say, oh yeah, remember that expert? Remember that like Physiker or that like that inventor we talked to or whatever. I'm gonna play that NPC. I'm gonna make that NPC into a PC, and then that just starts to build out the world even more. So it's really fun for some players, at least, to develop a kind of ensemble play instead of just playing the same character all the time. So now let's talk about overindulgence. The book says, a vice is not a reliable, controllable habit. It's a risk, and one that can drive your character to act against their own best interests. Right? That's what partially makes it a vice. When you overindulge, which is to say you clear more stress than you have on your stress track, you choose one consequence. One is attracting trouble. You select or roll one additional entanglement. So that's going to be from the entanglement table that we discussed in the entanglements episode. You can brag about your exploits. So you run your mouth and you take +2 heat. Your character vanishes for a few weeks. Play a different character in the meantime. It's basically like getting lost in your Vice. However, it now comes as a consequence of overindulgence. And when the character returns, they clear any harm that they had. So actually, this can be quite strong, but your GM may mandate that you cannot play this character for like a couple sessions. So that is something you'll have to discuss, because that is a very, very powerful result. And finally, your character can be tapped. Your current purveyor, your vice purveyor, cuts you off, so you have to find a new one. And this is really dangerous, because if you can't find one and you go through a downtime phase, you're going to take stress equal to the number of trauma you have. And so you can actually get pushed into another trauma just from being tapped and not being able to indulge your vice. So we've talked about Vice, we've talked about all the other downtime activities, we've seen how these are both ways for players to strategize about the game and to suffer the accelerating or intensifying pressure that the game puts on them. But to kind of wrap up talking about downtime activities, in the next episode, we are going to talk about NPC and faction downtime. And I will see you then.